Imagine holding a single piece of parchment in your hands, not just any document, but one that held the power to decide the rise and fall of empires. This wasn't a treaty or a declaration of war, but something far more subtle and profound, a map of a river. In the ancient world, rivers weren't merely sources of water or boundaries on a landscape. They were living, dynamic forces that could be harnessed, manipulated, and weaponized by those who understood their secrets. From the winding Nile to the mighty Yellow River, these waterways shaped human destiny in ways that still ripple through history, and the maps that charted them became some of the most coveted and dangerous tools ever created. Think about it, long before satellites or drones, generals and rulers relied on hand-drawn charts that revealed where a river could be crossed in secret, where its currents could trap an enemy fleet, or where its seasonal floods could be unleashed like a natural army. These maps were more than just ink on papyrus or clay. They were intelligence reports, strategic blueprints, and instruments of deception. They allowed ambitious leaders to move armies across continents, sustain supply lines over vast distances, and even rewrite the geography of entire regions to suit their imperial dreams. This was a time when knowledge wasn't just power, it was victory, survival, and domination. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden stories behind these ancient river maps and explore how they were used as silent weapons in some of history's most dramatic campaigns. You'll see how pharaohs used the Nile to launch surprise invasions, how Roman engineers turned European rivers into highways of conquest, and how Chinese strategists weaponized floods to drown their rivals. This isn't just a tale of battles and borders, it's a journey into the mind of ancient strategists who saw geography not as a passive backdrop, but as an active player in the great drama of human ambition. So settle in, because you're about to discover how the flow of a river could change the course of history, and why these ancient lessons still matter in today's world. Picture the earliest mapmakers not as explorers charting unknown lands, but as survivalists desperately trying to understand the lifeblood of their civilizations. In the arid landscapes of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, rivers were everything: the source of water, food, transportation, and ultimately, power. This absolute dependence gave birth to hydro-cartography, the science of mapping waterways, which began not as an academic exercise but as a matter of life and death. Scribes would carefully record the Nile's annual inundation, noting how far the floodwaters reached each year and which agricultural plots would be fertile. These weren't mere observations, they were data points that could predict famine or abundance, giving rulers unprecedented control over their people and resources. What made these early river maps so revolutionary was their dual nature. On the surface, they served practical daily needs, showing farmers where to plant, merchants where to trade, and sailors where to navigate safely. But beneath that utilitarian exterior lay a deeper, more strategic purpose. The same map that showed safe passages for trade vessels also revealed where an army might cross a river undetected under cover of darkness. Charts noting seasonal fluctuations didn't just help with irrigation planning, they indicated when river levels would be low enough for troops to march across or when spring melts might sweep away an enemy's defensive positions. This hidden layer of military intelligence transformed simple geographic documents into powerful tools of statecraft. Consider the Egyptian approach to mapping the Nile. Their charts went far beyond basic shorelines, documenting subtle changes in current patterns, hidden sandbars that could ground vessels, and ideal locations for ambushes along the river's twisting course. Temple archives contained meticulously detailed records of flood cycles going back generations, allowing priests and pharaohs to anticipate years of plenty or scarcity. This knowledge became a form of social control. By predicting harvests, rulers could manage grain reserves to prevent rebellions while planning military campaigns when neighboring states were weakest. The annual flood wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a strategic event that dictated the rhythm of warfare and expansion. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers presented different challenges and opportunities. Unlike the predictable Nile, these waterways were volatile and unpredictable, requiring even more sophisticated mapping techniques. Babylonian clay tablets have been discovered showing intricate canal systems branching off from the main rivers, complete with notations about flow rates and depth measurements. During sieges, rulers would use these maps to literally weaponize water diverting flows to cut off enemy cities from their water supply, or intentionally flooding regions to make them impassable to attacking forces. Controlling the maps meant controlling the water itself, and controlling the water meant holding the power of life and death over entire populations. The Chinese approach along the Yellow River developed with equally sophisticated but distinct characteristics. There, mapmakers focused on the river's notorious tendency to flood catastrophically, creating charts that showed not only navigation routes but also weak points in natural levees where waters could be deliberately released. Early dynasties recognized that whoever mastered the Yellow River's tempestuous nature could harness its power against rivals. These maps became so valuable that they were considered state secrets, with duplicate copies stored in multiple locations to prevent their loss from jeopardizing national security. Knowledge of the rivers was, in many ways, more protected than knowledge of troop movements or fortifications. What's fascinating about these early hydro-cartographic efforts is how they blended empirical observation with what we might now consider spiritual elements. Egyptian maps often included annotations about which river deities governed particular sections of the Nile, while Mesopotamian charts noted auspicious days for crossing certain points based on astrological observations. This combination of practical geography and belief systems created maps that served both tactical and psychological purposes, reinforcing the ruler's authority as someone who commanded not just armies but the very forces of nature itself. The mapmaker's art was thus both science and statecraft, measurement and mythology. This foundational period of river mapping established patterns that would endure for millennia. The practice of treating geographic knowledge as classified information, the strategic value of understanding seasonal patterns, and the potential for environmental manipulation, all these concepts emerged from these early civilizations' need to master their river systems. What began as simple survival sketches gradually evolved into sophisticated instruments of power, setting the stage for the increasingly complex military applications that would follow. The genie of geographic intelligence was out of the bottle, and empires would spend centuries learning how to wield this knowledge to their advantage. With the foundation of river cartography firmly established in the administrative centers of early empires, these documents quickly evolved from tools of domestic management into prized intelligence assets. In the high-stakes arena of ancient warfare, knowledge of the terrain wasn't just helpful, it was often the decisive factor between a triumphant campaign and a catastrophic defeat. Rivers, in particular, presented both the greatest obstacle and the greatest opportunity for any general seeking to move forces through unfamiliar lands. A well-drawn river map could reveal secrets invisible to the naked eye. A hidden ford where the waters ran shallow enough for cavalry to cross, a narrow bend where the current would slow supply barges to a crawl, or a sheltered tributary mouth where warships could lie in wait undetected. Consider the meticulous methods used to gather this vital intelligence. Before any major campaign, commanders would dispatch teams of scouts, often local guides paid handsomely for their knowledge, or specially trained soldiers skilled in observation and sketching. These operatives moved through enemy territory under various disguises, perhaps as merchants, pilgrims, or simple travelers, all the while mentally noting every geographic feature that could be militarily significant. They would measure river widths by pacing along banks, test depths with weighted lines, and note seasonal changes in water levels from conversations with riverside communities. This raw data would then be compiled by royal cartographers into coherent maps, annotated with symbols indicating potential ambush sites, fresh water sources, or areas prone to flooding. The creation of such a map was a painstaking process of synthesis and verification, often cross-referencing multiple sources to weed out deliberate misinformation. Alexander the Great's campaign into the Persian Empire provides a masterclass in this form of hydro-strategic intelligence, as his forces advanced into territories never before seen by Greek eyes. Alexander placed immense value on acquiring accurate river maps. Historical accounts describe how he would personally interrogate captured Persian officers and local chieftains about the layout of nearby waterways, paying particular attention to the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. This knowledge allowed him to execute one of his most brilliant maneuvers, the surprise crossing of the Hydrological River in present-day Pakistan to face King Porus's forces. Alexander's scouts had identified a section of the river that split into multiple shallow channels, obscured by a densely wooded island. While Porus's elephants and chariots waited at the main expected crossing point, Alexander led a portion of his army 17 miles upstream under cover of a violent thunderstorm, using the noise to mask their movement. They crossed the divided river channels safely while his remaining forces staged a diversionary attack at the original location. This tactical masterpiece, enabled by superior geographic intelligence, resulted in a decisive victory that might otherwise have been a bloody stalemate. The Persian Empire itself had long understood the value of such hydro-intelligence. When Darius I contemplated expanding eastward into the Indian subcontinent, his advisors presented him with detailed charts of the Indus River system, gathered over years of diplomatic missions and trade expeditions. These maps didn't just show the river's main course, they detailed the complex network of tributaries that spread like veins across the Punjab region, noting which channels were navigable during different seasons. Most crucially, Persian cartographers had documented the patterns of the monsoon rains that swelled these rivers to torrential levels each summer. By scheduling their military expeditions during the dry winter months when river levels dropped dramatically, Persian forces could cross waters that would have been impassable barriers just months earlier. This strategic timing, based on hydrological intelligence, allowed them to move troops and supplies with efficiency that stunned their opponents, who expected the rivers to provide natural defense. Beyond mere crossing points, these intelligence maps revealed subtler advantages. A commander examining a detailed river chart could identify oxbow lakes, abandoned river meanders that created quiet backwaters perfect for concealing troop movements or establishing hidden supply depots. They could pinpoint river confluences where two waterways met, creating natural hubs for controlling trade and military movement across a wide region. Perhaps most importantly, these maps highlighted elevation changes, showing where rivers descended through rapids or waterfalls that could serve as natural barriers, preventing enemy reinforcements from arriving by boat while allowing friendly forces to control the high ground overlooking these choke points. The very existence of such detailed maps often created a psychological advantage before the first soldier even crossed a border. when a conquering power demonstrated precise knowledge of a region's hydrology, naming minor tributaries that locals considered obscure knowledge or predicting seasonal flooding patterns with accuracy. It created an aura of inevitability about their conquest. Defenders realized that their familiar landscape offered no secrets to hide behind, that every potential defensive position was already known and likely countered in the invaders' plans. This demoralizing effect sometimes led to surrenders without significant fighting, as city-states concluded that resistance against an enemy with such complete geographic intelligence was futile. The river map had thus become more than a tool. It was a psychological weapon that could win wars before they began. But the most ingenious application of these river maps went far beyond gathering accurate intelligence. It involved the deliberate creation and distribution of false information. In the shadowy world of ancient military strategy, the ability to deceive an enemy about the very landscape they were fighting in represented the highest form of cunning. Rather than simply hiding their own maps, clever generals realized they could plant fabricated charts that would lead their opponents into making catastrophic mistakes. This practice transformed cartography from a tool of enlightenment into an instrument of psychological manipulation, where the most dangerous lies were those dressed in the convincing guise of geographic truth. Imagine the careful craftsmanship required to create a believable decoy map. It couldn't be obviously wrong, or the ruse would be immediately detected. Instead, ancient cartographers had to embed subtle falsehoods within mostly accurate information, perhaps showing a deep, navigable channel where in reality there were only treacherous shallows, or omitting a crucial ford that would have provided safe passage. These forgeries were often leaked through seemingly careless channels. A map left behind in an abandoned camp, a talkative captive allowed to escape with false information, or a traitorous scout secretly working for the other side. The goal was always the same: to make the enemy believe they had stumbled upon genuine intelligence, while leading them toward geographic traps where nature itself would do the fighting. The Carthaginian general Hannibal provides one of history's most speculated about examples of this deceptive art during his audacious crossing of the Alps into Italy. Roman historians suggest that as Hannibal approached the Rhone River with his army and elephants, he became aware that Roman scouts were monitoring his movements. Recognizing that an unopposed crossing would be impossible if the Romans knew his true intentions, Hannibal may have orchestrated an elaborate geographic deception. According to some accounts, he dispatched a contingent of troops miles upstream with orders to make a conspicuous show of building rafts and preparing crossing equipment. Meanwhile, his main force actually crossed much farther downstream at a point his scouts had identified as ideal but which appeared unsuitable from a distance. To sell the illusion, Hannibal's cartographers might have created maps intentionally exaggerating the difficulties of the downstream route while making the upstream location appear more favorable. When Roman spies intercepted these documents or observed the decoy preparations, they would naturally assume the crossing would occur where the Carthaginians seemed most prepared. By the time the Romans realized their error, Hannibal's main force was already across the river and marching toward the mountains, having gained precious days on his surprised opponents. This strategy of hydro-cartographic deception appeared in various forms across different ancient civilizations. In Han Dynasty China, military treatises explicitly recommended the creation of false path maps to mislead invading forces about river conditions. Chinese strategists understood that nomadic tribes from the northern steppes feared and misunderstood the great rivers of central China, having little experience with large-scale water crossings. By allowing fabricated maps to fall into enemy hands, maps that might show the Yellow River as impassable during certain seasons, or that exaggerated the width of certain channels, Han commanders could steer invading armies toward predetermined killing zones where they would be vulnerable to ambush or counterattack. The maps themselves became bait in an elaborate trap, exploiting the enemy's hunger for geographic knowledge against them. The Roman military machine also perfected this art of cartographic misdirection, particularly during their campaigns in Germania and Britain, where unfamiliar river systems posed significant challenges. Roman engineers would sometimes create multiple versions of their operational maps, accurate ones for their own commanders, and deliberately flawed copies that might be lost during cavalry skirmishes or left behind during strategic retreats. These decoy maps often contained subtle errors regarding river depths or crossing points, luring Germanic tribes into attempting maneuvers that would leave them stranded midstream or bogged down in unexpected marshes. The Roman historian Tacitus describes how local chieftains, having captured what they believed were priceless Roman military documents, would then base their defensive plans on these fabricated geographic details, only to discover too late that the rivers didn't behave as promised when Roman legions arrived at the actual crossing points. What made these geographic deceptions so effective was their self-reinforcing nature. Unlike false intelligence about troop numbers or supply levels, which could be quickly verified or disproven, erroneous river information often couldn't be tested until it was too late. An army marching toward what a map promised was a fordable river couldn't know the truth until they reached the banks and attempted to cross, by which time they might be committed to a course of action with no easy retreat. Similarly, naval commanders relying on falsified charts showing deep channels might suddenly find their warships grounded on unseen sandbars just as enemy fire ships descended upon them. The environment itself became an unwitting accomplice in these deceptions, punishing those who had trusted in false representations of its nature. This practice required not just cartographic skill but deep psychological insight into how enemies would interpret geographic information. The most successful deceptions played upon an opponent's existing assumptions and fears. If a general already believed a certain river was treacherous, a forged map confirming those fears would seem particularly credible. Likewise, showing an enemy what they wanted to see, an easy route through difficult territory, often proved more effective than creating obviously ideal conditions. The art lay in making the deception just challenging enough to be believable, understanding that experienced commanders would naturally suspect anything that seemed too convenient. The legacy of these ancient practices extends far beyond their immediate tactical benefits. They established a principle that would echo through military history, that controlling the geographic narrative could be as important as controlling the territory itself. Long before modern propaganda techniques, ancient strategists understood that perception could reshape reality, that a skillfully drawn line on a map could influence decisions more powerfully than 1,000 soldiers. This recognition elevated cartography from a merely descriptive practice to an active participant in the contest of empires, where the pen truly could be mightier than the sword, especially when that pen was drawing false rivers to drown unsuspecting armies. While deception and intelligence gathering represented the cunning side of river warfare, the true backbone of imperial expansion lay in the far more practical matter of logistics. An army, no matter how brave or well-led, is ultimately a massive consumer of resources, constantly needing food, weapons, and reinforcements to remain effective. In the ancient world, moving these vast quantities of material overland was a slow, arduous, and vulnerable process. A single supply train could require thousands of pack animals and their handlers, moving at a snail's pace across difficult terrain and constantly exposed to ambush, bad weather, and the simple mathematical reality that these animals would consume much of the fodder they were carrying long before reaching the front lines. Rivers presented the perfect solution to this existential problem of military campaigning, acting as natural conveyor belts that could move heavier loads farther and faster than any land-based alternative, but only for those who possessed the maps to navigate them effectively. The Roman approach to this logistical challenge was nothing short of revolutionary, transforming their entire military doctrine around the predictable flow of European waterways. Roman engineering corps would advance ahead of the main legions, tasked with creating incredibly detailed charts of rivers like the Danube, Rhine, and Rhone. These weren't simple sketches of riverbanks. They were sophisticated operational documents noting everything from the precise depth at different water levels and the composition of the riverbed to the location of every single tributary, rapid, and potential landing site. Crucially, they documented seasonal patterns with meticulous care, understanding that a river that was a placid highway in summer could become a raging torrent in spring or a series of isolated frozen pools in winter. This knowledge allowed Roman quartermasters to create precise timetables for supply movements, ensuring that grain barges from Gaul would arrive at Danube fortresses just as existing stocks were running low, or that reinforcements from Italy would disembark at the exact moment a campaign was set to begin. This system turned the rivers into a reliable, predictable extension of the Roman state itself, allowing legions to operate thousands of miles from home for years on end. This riverine logistical network enabled the Roman practice of establishing castra, or permanent fortified camps, along strategic points of major rivers. These were not temporary field fortifications, but sophisticated military towns with granaries, workshops, and hospitals, all supplied primarily by water. A map of the Rhine frontier during the reign of Augustus would show a string of these fortresses positioned at carefully mapped intervals corresponding to a day's march or a convenient confluence with a smaller river that could serve as a secondary supply route. Each fortress maintained its own fleet of rivercraft, from small scout boats to large cargo vessels capable of carrying tons of supplies. The maps ensured these boats could navigate safely, avoiding seasonal sandbanks and identifying sheltered anchorages protected from the weather and potential attackers. This system created a web of interdependence where no single fortress was isolated. If one came under siege, others could quickly dispatch reinforcements and supplies by water, often arriving much faster than an enemy could anticipate. Half a world away, the Mauryan Empire in ancient India achieved similar logistical miracles through its mastery of the Ganges River basin. The Ganges, with its vast network of tributaries spreading across the northern plains like the branches of a great tree, offered unparalleled access to the richest agricultural lands of the subcontinent. Mauryan cartographers created maps that were essentially logistical flowcharts, showing how grain from the fertile fields of Magadha could be transported via barges to army camps on the distant frontiers. These maps detailed not just navigation hazards but also the locations of royal storehouses along the riverbanks, places where harvests could be centralized and then redistributed as needed to support military campaigns. The efficiency of this system allowed Mauryan emperors like Chandragupta and Ashoka to field and sustain enormous armies reportedly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a scale that would have been logistically impossible without water transport. The strategic advantage granted by these river maps extended beyond simply moving goods. They enabled campaign planning on a grand geographic and temporal scale. A general examining a detailed river chart could calculate exactly how long it would take to move a legion from Rome to the German frontier by combining marching times between rivers with sailing times down those waterways. He could identify points where rivers came close enough to each other that supplies could be portaged carried overland, from one watershed to another, effectively creating water-based supply chains across entire continents. Perhaps most importantly, these maps allowed for the creation of alternative routes. If an enemy force blocked a primary river, supply convoys could be rerouted through a mapped tributary network that might add time but ensured the army would not be cut off. This flexibility provided a crucial advantage over adversaries who, lacking such detailed geographic intelligence, often found their own supply lines stretched to breaking point, while their Roman or Mauryan opponents seemed to have a magically endless stream of provisions. The absence of such cartographic insight could lead to disaster, as numerous failed invasions throughout history demonstrate. An army marching into unknown territory without accurate river maps would inevitably find itself constrained to following known roads or coastlines, unable to strike out across country for fear of losing its supply connection. Should they attempt to use rivers without proper charts, they risked grounding their boats on unexpected shoals, being swept into dangerous rapids, or wasting precious campaign time searching for viable landing sites. Meanwhile, defenders operating with detailed knowledge of their home rivers could strike at these vulnerable supply lines with devastating effect, using small, fast boats to ambush cumbersome transport vessels at narrow points identified on their maps. In this way, control of hydrological knowledge often determined not just the success of conquest, but the very ability to sustain military presence in hostile territories, making river maps among the most valuable assets any expanding empire could possess. No river on Earth was more thoroughly mapped, measured, and mastered than the Nile in ancient Egypt. For the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, this wasn't just a body of water. It was a dynamic, predictable highway for projecting power, and their meticulously detailed charts were the battle plans that turned geographic intimacy into imperial dominance. While other empires struggled to understand foreign rivers, Egyptian commanders operated with the confidence of someone moving through their own home, knowing every hidden current, every seasonal shift, and every potential ambush point along the river's immense length. This unparalleled familiarity transformed the Nile from a simple logistical tool into the central nervous system of an expansionist empire. Consider the strategic advantage granted by the Nile's predictable annual flood. While other ancient rulers saw natural disasters in such events, Egyptian strategists, armed with generations of flood data encoded in their temple maps, saw opportunity. These documents didn't just record past inundations, they used complex mathematical models to forecast future flood levels with remarkable accuracy. A pharaoh like Thutmose III could therefore plan his military campaigns with a calendar of environmental chaos in mind. He knew precisely when the Nile would crest its banks, not only in Egypt but hundreds of miles upstream in Nubia. This allowed him to time his invasions for when enemy territories would be distracted by the immense task of flood management, their fields submerged, their populations displaced, their armies bogged down, while his own forces, operating from the stable plateau of Egyptian knowledge, moved with unimpeded efficiency. The flood became a natural preliminary bombardment, softening up targets before the first Egyptian soldier even arrived. The physical composition of these Nile maps reveals their sophisticated military purpose. Drawn on papyrus scrolls that could be easily transported on campaign, they featured detailed annotations of all 6 cataracts, the rocky rapids that interrupted navigation south into Nubia. For a less knowledgeable invader, these cataracts were formidable barriers, but Egyptian maps charted precise routes around them, noting portage paths where boats could be dragged over land and identifying calm channels that could be navigated during high water. This intelligence was crucial for Thutmose's 17 recorded campaigns into Nubia and the Levant. His forces could move entire fleets of troop transports and supply barges upriver, surprising enemies who believed the cataracts made them untouchable from the north. The maps essentially erased these natural defenses, turning obstacles into avenues of attack. naval coordination reached a level of precision that would be impressive even by modern standards, all thanks to these river charts. An Egyptian campaign typically involved a combined arms approach where ground forces marched along the riverbank, while a naval flotilla paralleled their movement on the water. The maps ensured perfect synchronization between these two elements. They marked ideal landing beaches where troops could disembark rapidly, hidden backwaters where ships could conceal themselves before a raid, and strategic river islands that could serve as temporary fortresses or supply depots. During his famous Battle of Megiddo in Canaan, Thutmose used his knowledge of the Nile's distant tributaries and connected overland routes to move his army with shocking speed, arriving before the rebellious Canaanite coalition had fully assembled. The victory was so complete it established Egyptian hegemony in the region for centuries, a direct result of superior geographic planning. Beyond mere navigation, the Egyptians weaponized the very ecology of the river. Their maps included information on prevailing winds, the reliable northerlies that blew against the Nile's current. This understanding allowed their sailing vessels to travel south with the wind at their backs while using the current to drift northward, creating an endlessly efficient logistical loop. They also charted areas known for papyrus growth, crucial for boat repair, and mosquito-infested marshes to be avoided when making camp to prevent disease from decimating their troops. This holistic environmental knowledge meant that while foreign armies in Egypt succumbed to malaria and dysentery, the native forces remained healthy and operational, their campaigns prolonged by an intimate understanding of how to live off the river without falling victim to its dangers. The psychological impact of this hydro-strategic mastery cannot be overstated. When Egyptian envoys presented themselves in foreign courts, they often brought with them stunningly accurate maps of the local region's hydrology, rivers the locals themselves only partially understood. This demonstration of omniscience was a powerful tool of intimidation, suggesting that the Egyptian god-king's knowledge knew no borders. Why resist a power that already knows the depth of your rivers and the timing of your seasons better than you do? This cartographic diplomacy often achieved what armies could not, convincing smaller states to accept vassal status rather than face the inevitable conquest that such detailed intelligence seemed to foretell. The map scroll was thus as potent as the spear in expanding the Egyptian empire, proving that the deepest conquests often begin not with invasion but with information. While the Egyptians mastered their predictable Nile, the civilizations between the Tigris and Euphrates faced a far more volatile and contentious reality. In Mesopotamia, water was never a guaranteed blessing. It was a prize to be seized, a weapon to be wielded, and the ultimate symbol of authority in a land where life itself depended on controlling the twin rivers' capricious flows. This wasn't just about irrigation for crops, it was about survival and supremacy, a brutal contest where the most valuable military asset wasn't a bronze-tipped spear, but a carefully drawn map showing exactly how to divert a canal or block a watercourse. The city-states that rose and fell in this fertile crescent understood a fundamental truth that would echo through history. Whoever controlled the water controlled the destiny of everyone downstream. The very geography of the region made hydraulic warfare inevitable. Unlike the singular, well-defined Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates formed a complex, shifting network of channels across a flat alluvial plain. A map from the city of wouldn't just show the river's main course. It would detail a labyrinth of man-made canals, dikes, and feeder channels that spread water across the countryside. These weren't merely agricultural features, they were the region's circulatory system, and in times of war they became its pressure points. A clever ruler, armed with an accurate chart, could literally turn off the tap to a rival city. By using slave labor to dam or divert a key canal based on their maps, they could leave an enemy's fields parched and their reservoirs empty, forcing surrender without a single soldier being lost in direct combat. This was siege warfare on an environmental scale, where victory went to the side that could hold its thirst the longest. Perhaps no one weaponized this knowledge more ruthlessly than the Assyrian kings, who transformed hydraulic engineering into a tool of terror. Sennacherib, one of Assyria's most formidable rulers, didn't just use maps to plan attacks. He used them to redesign the very landscape to proclaim his dominance. His detailed charts of the Tigris River and its tributaries enabled one of the ancient world's most staggering engineering projects. A vast system of canals and aqueducts designed to bring fresh water directly to his capital, Nineveh, from mountains over 30 miles away. But this wasn't merely a municipal public works project. The aqueducts served a dual military purpose. They ensured Nineveh could withstand any siege with a seemingly endless water supply, while simultaneously allowing Sennacherib to deprive downstream regions of that same water. His maps showed him exactly where to build weirs and dams to starve rebellious territories into submission, making the river itself an instrument of punishment. The psychological impact of this environmental manipulation was profound. When Sennacherib's armies arrived at a rebellious city, they often came not just with siege towers but with teams of engineers carrying scrolls filled with hydrological maps. Before launching an assault, they might begin by deliberately breaching levees upstream to flood the city's outskirts, drowning fields and drowning hope. Alternatively, they might divert the city's main water source, leaving the inhabitants to watch their children grow weak from thirst. These actions sent a terrifying message. The Assyrian king was not just a conqueror of men, but a master of the elements themselves. He commanded the rivers that the people worshipped as gods. How could mere mortals hope to resist a ruler who held such power? This calculated demonstration of geographic control was designed to break the enemy's spirit long before his walls were breached. Babylonian rulers, though often cast as victims of Assyrian aggression, were equally adept at this form of cartographic warfare. Their maps, inscribed on clay tablets, detailed the complex relationships between the Euphrates and the intricate network of canals that fed their famous hanging gardens. During periods of conflict with upstream rivals like or Uruk, these documents became vital defensive assets. They showed where temporary diversion channels could be dug to maintain water flow even if the main river was blocked, and identified underground aquifers that could be tapped in emergencies. The ability to maintain a food supply and fresh water during a prolonged siege, all guided by precise geographic knowledge, often meant the difference between becoming a subject state and retaining independence. The maps ensured that even under duress, life within the city walls could continue with a semblance of normalcy, demoralizing attackers who expected a quick victory through thirst. This ancient legacy of water conflict in Mesopotamia is startlingly relevant today. Modern satellite images of the Tigris-Euphrates basin reveal a patchwork of dams and irrigation projects in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq that eerily mirror the canal systems of ancient and Babylon. The political tensions over water rights in the region are a direct continuation of those early hydraulic wars, proving that the fundamental equation remains unchanged. Control of the maps that detail the flow of water still equates to control over life, prosperity, and power. The weapons may have evolved from clay tablets to digital satellites, but the strategy of using hydro-knowledge as an instrument of dominance is a practice as old as civilization itself, born in the fierce competition between those first Mesopotamian city-states. If the Nile represented controlled power and the Tigris-Euphrates a tool for siegecraft, then China's Yellow River was something far more terrifying, a volatile, unpredictable force of nature that the Qin dynasty learned not just to manage, but to harness as a weapon of mass destruction on their path to unifying the warring states. This wasn't a river to be navigated or diverted with simple certainty. It was a monstrous waterway nicknamed China's Sorrow for its catastrophic, unpredictable floods that could wipe out entire regions without warning. Where others saw only random disaster, the Qin strategists saw a pattern to be decoded, a lethal potential to be unleashed against their rivals with chilling precision. And their secret weapon was an entirely new kind of map that didn't just describe the river, but predicted and weaponized its wrath. The Qin approach to cartography was fundamentally different from their contemporaries. While Egyptian maps recorded seasonal patterns and Mesopotamian charts detailed man-made canals, Qin maps were essentially engineering blueprints for environmental warfare. Their scribes and surveyors created incredibly detailed diagrams of the river's extensive system of dikes and levees, most of which had been built haphazardly by various states over centuries in a desperate attempt to control the flooding. But the Qin didn't just map these structures, they assessed their weaknesses. Their documents noted which earthen walls were poorly maintained, which sections were built on unstable ground, and exactly where a strategic breach would release the most devastating torrent of water onto enemy lands downstream. This turned the river's natural destructive power into a deliberate, calculated instrument of conquest. One of the most infamous applications of this strategy was against the wealthy state of Wei, a powerful rival that controlled fertile plains directly downstream from Qin territory. According to historical accounts, during a period of military stalemate, a Qin general ordered his engineers to secretly break a critical levee holding back the Yellow River during the spring flood season. The resulting deluge didn't just inconvenience the Wei army, it carved a new channel for the river itself, swallowing cities, drowning thousands of soldiers encamped on the floodplain, and submerging the region's prime agricultural land under tons of silt and water. The Wei state, its economy shattered and its army decimated by the very environment it depended on, was forced into swift submission. This was more than a tactical victory. It was a statement that the Qin could command the forces of nature itself to destroy their enemies without ever drawing a sword. Yet the true genius of Qin hydro strategy lay in its dual nature. While they weaponized the river's destructive power against others, they simultaneously embarked on the most ambitious civil engineering project of the age to make themselves immune to those same tactics. This was the Zhenguo Canal, a massive irrigation system stretching over 100 miles that was planned and constructed using those same detailed river maps. The maps showed exactly where to divert water from the Jing River, a tributary of the Wei, to transform the arid plains of Qin into the most productive agricultural region in all of China. This wasn't just about farming, it was a logistical masterstroke that allowed the Qin state to support enormous standing armies with surplus grain, making long campaigns possible while their rivals struggled with food shortages. The canal's construction, guided by precise elevation maps and flow calculations, created a devastating economic asymmetry across the warring states. Qin fields flourished with reliable irrigation, producing bumper crops year after year that filled state granaries to overflowing. Meanwhile, downstream rivals often found their water supplies diminished by the Qin diversions, leading to poorer harvests and growing instability. The Qin could then use their food surplus as both a carrot and a stick, offering aid to sway neutral states or simply waiting for enemies to weaken from famine before attacking. This combination of agricultural abundance and hydrological terrorism made the Qin seemingly unstoppable, their power growing with each season as their rivals grew weaker, both from deliberate flooding and from the quiet, constant diversion of water resources. This ruthless integration of cartography, engineering, and strategy reached its apex under the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who completed the unification of China. His administration didn't just use these river maps for conquest, they institutionalized them for control. After defeating each rival state, Qin officials would immediately seize their hydrological records and maps, absorbing centuries of local knowledge about river behavior into the central imperial archives. They then systematically destroyed or altered the original documents, ensuring that only the Qin court possessed complete knowledge of China's river systems. This made rebellion practically impossible. How could a former state like Chu or Kai hope to reclaim independence when they no longer fully understood the very waterways that sustained them, and when the central government held the power to flood or starve them at will? The control of geographic knowledge became the ultimate tool of empire, proving that the most enduring conquests are not just of land, but of information. While the Qin dynasty was perfecting the art of turning rivers into environmental weapons, an entirely different approach to hydro-strategy was unfolding on the opposite side of the world. The Roman Empire, in its relentless expansion across Europe, developed a philosophy of river mastery that was less about dramatic manipulation and more about systematic integration. For Rome, rivers weren't primarily tools for destruction. They were the empire's circulatory system, natural highways that could move legions and supplies with an efficiency that their barbarian adversaries could scarcely comprehend. This logistical brilliance, enabled by some of the most detailed and practical river maps ever produced, became the silent engine of Roman conquest, turning the wild waterways of Germania and Gaul into disciplined extensions of imperial will. The Roman approach began not with generals but with teams of specialized military engineers known as agrimensors. These were not mere mapmakers, they were the empire's geographic intelligence corps, equipped with sophisticated tools like the groma for surveying straight lines and the chorobates for determining precise water levels. Before any major campaign, these engineers would be dispatched along river systems, often under military guard, to conduct painstaking surveys. Their mission was to create operational charts that recorded far more than simple shorelines. They measured current velocities at different seasons, mapped every significant tributary confluence, identified all potential landing beaches, and, most crucially, documented the exact locations of fords where armies could cross without boats. These documents became the playbook for Roman expansion, transforming unknown and threatening landscapes into structured, predictable spaces where Roman military doctrine could be applied with maximum effect. This systematic knowledge allowed the Romans to establish their famous riverine frontiers, particularly along the Rhine and Danube. These weren't just vague border zones, but precisely engineered military corridors where the river itself became both barrier and highway. The maps enabled the construction of the Limes Germanicus, a network of forts, watchtowers, and signal stations positioned at optimal intervals determined by river navigation times. A message could travel from the North Sea to the Black Sea faster via this coordinated river-based system than through any other means, allowing threats to be identified and responded to with astonishing speed. Each fortress was carefully placed based on hydrological knowledge, sited on high ground above flood levels, yet with direct access to the river for supply, with visibility over long stretches of water, and positioned to control strategic confluences where tributaries joined the main flow. This wasn't random placement, it was geographic chess on a continental scale, with each piece positioned according to a master plan drawn from those river maps. The tactical advantages granted by this hydro-intelligence were demonstrated repeatedly in Rome's campaigns against Germanic tribes. While local warriors knew their immediate territory intimately, they lacked the systematic overview that Roman maps provided. A tribal chieftain might know a good crossing point near his village, but Roman commanders possessed charts showing every viable ford along a 100-mile stretch of river. This allowed for devastating maneuvers where legions would feint a crossing at one location, drawing the defensive forces to that point, while the main force crossed unexpectedly miles away at a spot identified on their maps as suitable for rapid movement. The startled defenders, now out of position, would find Roman forces already establishing fortified bridgeheads on their side of the river. By the time they regrouped, the Romans would have consolidated their position and begun pushing inland, their supplies flowing steadily across the river from the secure rear areas. Perhaps the most impressive application of this river knowledge was in the sheer scale of Roman mobility. The ability to move entire legions, thousands of men with their equipment, artillery, and months of supplies across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory was a logistical miracle that depended entirely on water transport. A Roman army campaigning in Germania didn't march if it could float. The maps allowed quartermasters to pre-plan entire campaign seasons around river navigation, knowing exactly how long it would take barges to travel from supply depots in Gaul to forward bases on the Rhine. They could schedule movements to coincide with optimal water levels, avoiding seasonal low water that would ground their vessels or spring floods that made navigation dangerous. This efficiency meant Roman forces could arrive fresh and fully supplied at the battlefield, while their Germanic opponents, forced to march overland and live off the land, arrived exhausted and with limited resources. The battle was often half won before the first javelin was thrown, decided not by courage but by calories and cartography. This river-based system also created a self-reinforcing cycle of control. As the Romans established their fortresses along the waterways, they simultaneously dominated both the physical and economic landscape. Their control of the rivers meant they could regulate trade, moving their own goods freely while intercepting or taxing any native traffic. Germanic tribes found their traditional movements and economic exchanges increasingly constrained by this Roman hydro-hegemony. The maps that had enabled military conquest now facilitated economic domination, as Roman officials used their knowledge of river systems to establish toll stations at strategic narrows and confluences. A tribe that might resist Roman legions directly often found itself compelled to submit indirectly, as the reality set in that life outside the Roman system meant being cut off from the vital waterways that had sustained their ancestors for generations. The conquest was thus completed not just by the sword, but by the oar and the map that guided it. While the Romans were engineering their riverine frontiers in Europe, an equally impressive system of hydro-strategic control was taking shape on the Indian subcontinent under the Mauryan Empire. Here, the mighty Indus and Ganges river systems presented both the greatest challenge and the ultimate opportunity for unification, and the Mauryan rulers developed a remarkably sophisticated approach to river cartography that went far beyond mere military applications. Their maps became comprehensive instruments of statecraft, blending military logistics, economic management, and psychological domination into a single geographic framework that sustained one of the ancient world's most extensive empires. The Mauryan advantage began with their systematic documentation of the subcontinent's complex monsoon patterns, knowledge that turned a climatic phenomenon into a strategic timetable. Their cartographers created charts that were essentially meteorological guides to river behavior, predicting exactly when the summer rains would swell the Ganges and Indus to impassable torrents, and when the winter dry season would reduce these same waterways to chains of manageable streams and exposed sandbanks. This allowed generals like Chandragupta's brilliant advisor Chanakya to plan campaigns with nature as their ally rather than their adversary. Army divisions could be positioned during the dry months when rivers were crossable at multiple points, then supplied via barges during the monsoon when water transport became exceptionally efficient. While opponents found themselves isolated by seasonal flooding, Mauryan forces maintained communication and supply lines across the suddenly expanded river highways, turning what should have been a campaign-halting obstacle into their greatest logistical advantage. This mastery of seasonal hydrology enabled some of the most ambitious military operations in ancient Indian history. Historical accounts suggest that during Chandragupta's campaign against the Nanda Empire, his forces utilized detailed maps of the Ganges tributary system to execute a multi-pronged offensive that caught their opponents completely off guard. While the main army advanced along the traditional overland route, smaller, highly mobile units traveled by boat along lesser-known waterways that the maps showed were navigable during that particular season. These floating contingents could appear unexpectedly behind enemy lines, raid supply depots located conveniently near riverbanks for the defenders' convenience, and then disappear down river before an effective response could be organized. The river system, rather than providing defensive barriers, became a series of hidden highways that allowed the Mauryan forces to strike from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the impression of an army both everywhere and nowhere. The construction of pontoon bridges across major rivers represents another fascinating application of this cartographic knowledge. The Mauryans didn't simply throw temporary bridges across any convenient point. Their maps identified ideal locations based on a complex set of geographic factors. They sought out river narrows where the span would be shortest, but also where the current was predictable and the banks provided solid anchoring points. Perhaps most importantly, these crossing points were chosen with strategic control in mind, positioned to connect with existing road networks on both sides, to be defensible from high ground, and to serve as permanent transportation hubs once the military need had passed. A Mauryan pontoon bridge was never just a temporary military expedient. It was the seed of future economic and administrative control, a physical manifestation of the empire's intent to permanently integrate conquered territories into its network. Beyond pure military applications, the Mauryans demonstrated an unprecedented understanding of hydraulic governance, using water control as a tool of political domination. Ashoka's edicts, carved on pillars and rocks across the empire, repeatedly emphasized the state's role in constructing irrigation canals, maintaining wells, and planting shade trees along travel routes. These weren't merely benevolent public works, they were instruments of pacification and control implemented according to detailed geographic surveys. By controlling the water supply to recently conquered regions, the Mauryan administration could reward cooperation with reliable irrigation while subtly punishing resistance through administrative delays in canal maintenance. A province that remained loyal would find its fields flourishing under expertly managed water flows detailed in the imperial maps, while a rebellious region might suddenly discover its irrigation channels silting up or its reservoir repairs mysteriously postponed until attitudes improved. The archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, suggests the Mauryans maintained a central cartographic archive where information from all corners of the empire was synthesized into operational documents. Regional governors were likely required to submit updated hydrological surveys, noting changes in river courses, siltation patterns in harbors, and the condition of irrigation infrastructure. This continuous flow of geographic intelligence allowed the central administration to anticipate problems before they became crises, diverting grain shipments around a river that maps indicated was experiencing unusual silting, or pre-positioning engineering teams to reinforce levees in regions where seasonal flooding threatened to disrupt military supply lines. The empire essentially operated with a constantly updating geographic database that informed decisions from military deployment to tax collection. This holistic approach to river cartography reached its philosophical zenith under Ashoka following his conversion to Buddhism. Where earlier maps had been primarily instruments of conquest, Ashoka's reign saw them transformed into tools for integrating and unifying diverse territories. His administrators used detailed river basin maps to plan the placement of rest houses, medicinal herb gardens, and watering stations along pilgrimage routes, deliberately using the existing geographic framework to encourage cultural and economic exchange across the empire. The same waterways that had once carried invasion barges now facilitated the movement of missionaries, merchants, and administrators, all operating according to the geographic logic encoded in those master maps. The river systems became the literal and metaphorical arteries through which the lifeblood of Mauryan civilization flowed, connecting disparate regions into something resembling a unified whole. The legacy of this hydro-strategic thinking extended far beyond the Mauryan Empire itself. Their systematic approach to river mapping established an administrative precedent that would influence subsequent Indian dynasties for centuries, creating a tradition where control of geographic knowledge was considered as fundamental to governance as control of the army or treasury. The Indus River, which had nurtured one of humanity's earliest civilizations millennia before, had now been fully transformed into an instrument of imperial ambition, its currents charted, its seasons calculated, and its potential harnessed to serve the vision of rulers who understood that true power flowed not just through armies, but through the waterways that sustained them. Moving beyond the grand strategies of empire, river maps found another devastating application in the intimate, chaotic realm of naval combat, where a single hidden sandbar or a misunderstood current could decide the fate of entire fleets in a matter of minutes. Unlike the open sea, rivers presented a uniquely confined battlefield, a narrow, twisting corridor where maneuverability was severely limited, and geographic knowledge offered an almost insurmountable advantage. This environment transformed traditional naval tactics. Here, brute force and numbers mattered less than knowing exactly where the riverbed dropped away into deep channels or where a submerged logjam could snag a hull. The commanders who mastered these aquatic labyrinths didn't just fight their enemy, they enlisted the river itself as a silent ally, turning its hidden features into an arsenal of natural weapons. The Persian campaigns along the Nile provide a classic example of this riverine cunning. When the Achaemenid Empire sought to solidify its control over Egypt, their admirals faced the daunting task of confronting Egyptian naval forces who knew every inch of their home waters. Persian strategy therefore relied heavily on acquiring and creating detailed charts that revealed the Nile's secrets not apparent from the surface. Their maps meticulously documented the ever-shifting sandbanks that could ground deep draft warships, the calm back eddies where squadrons could lie in wait unseen behind river bends, and the narrowest points where the current accelerated, making vessels moving upstream vulnerable to attack from the faster-flowing downstream direction. This intelligence allowed them to execute ambushes that seemed to come from nowhere, using the river's own dynamics to disorient and trap the more experienced Egyptian sailors. Perhaps the most terrifying application of this knowledge was the use of fire ships on constricted waterways. Chinese naval commanders on the Yangtze became masters of this horrifying tactic during the Warring States period. Their maps didn't just show the river's course, they calculated flow rates and identified perfect ambush points where a tributary junction created a natural bottleneck. They would pack old vessels with dry reeds, sulfur, and oil, then set them ablaze and release them into the current at precisely mapped locations. Guided by pilots who knew exactly how the river would behave, these floating infernos would drift directly into enemy fleets moored or moving through these choke points. The confusion was absolute. Ships packed tightly together in the narrow channel had nowhere to escape, their attempts to maneuver often leading them aground on sandbars the Chinese had carefully avoided. The geography, as interpreted through those maps, did the killing more efficiently than any boarding party. This principle of using the environment as a weapon was not lost on the Greek world during the protracted agony of the Peloponnesian War. Athenian naval supremacy in the Aegean was unquestioned, but their conflict with Sparta often spilled over into coastal raids and attacks on supply lines, where knowledge of local river mouths became crucial. Athenian triremes, though primarily sea-going vessels, were designed with a shallow draft that allowed them to penetrate surprisingly far upriver in pursuit of Spartan grain transports. Athenian commanders like Phormio were known to spend days studying charts of river entrances, noting the complex interplay of tides and currents that could either sweep their ships effortlessly into an estuary or leave them embarrassingly stranded on a falling tide just as the enemy appeared. One documented engagement involved an ambush on a Spartan supply convoy attempting to use the Evrotas River to bypass Athenian coastal patrols. The Athenian commanders, consulting maps provided by local sympathizers, knew that the river's mouth was deceptively wide but funneled quickly into a deep but narrow channel flanked by extensive mudflats that were exposed at low tide. They timed their attack for the moment the leading Spartan transport ships had committed to this channel on an incoming tide. As the Spartan vessels advanced, the faster Athenian triremes swept in from the sea, using their superior knowledge of the tidal flow to position themselves between the convoy and the open water. The rear Spartan ships, panicking, tried to turn back but found the falling tide had already begun to drain water from over the mudflats, leaving them stuck and helpless. The battle was less a fight and more a systematic capture, all orchestrated by understanding a few critical lines on a tidal chart. The success of such ambushes relied on a sophisticated understanding of hydrology that went far beyond simple depth measurements. The best river maps included data on seasonal variations in water flow, the composition of the riverbed, whether it was soft silt that would swallow an anchor or firm clay that would hold it fast, and even the prevailing winds that could affect sailing vessels in a constricted valley. This allowed a clever admiral to attack when conditions were perfect for him and disastrous for his opponent. A fleet might be lured into a river when the water was high and seemingly navigable, only to find itself trapped when seasonal rains ceased and the water level dropped, cutting off their retreat. This transformation of rivers from passive landscapes into active, lethal participants in conflict represents one of the most ingenious applications of ancient cartography. A map was no longer just a representation of space, but a script for a dramatic play where the river was both stage and actor. Those who could read the script could direct the tragedy, ensuring their enemy played the role of the victim, caught in a geographic trap they never saw coming. The lesson was clear: on a well-mapped river, the most dangerous enemy was never the one on the opposing deck, but the water flowing beneath it and the hidden earth below that, waiting to rise up and seize the unprepared. But perhaps the most sophisticated expression of this engineering ambition emerged from the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, where river maps guided the creation of an entire hydraulic civilization designed for both prosperity and impregnability. The Khmer capital of Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a monumental exercise in environmental manipulation centered around the Mekong River and its tributaries. Khmer engineers produced incredibly detailed charts of the region's complex water systems, documenting not just the main river channels but the subtle elevation changes across the floodplains that allowed them to design a vast network of reservoirs, canals, and moats. These weren't merely agricultural features, they formed an integrated system that could sustain the population during prolonged sieges while creating formidable water barriers against attackers. The famous West Barre Reservoir, stretching 5 miles long and 1.4 miles wide, was essentially a strategic water battery. its construction guided by elevation maps that ensured it could gravity feed the city's defensive moats and irrigation channels even during dry seasons when besieging armies would be struggling for fresh water. This cartographically planned hydraulic system turned the entire region into a fortress that could outlast any conventional siege, demonstrating how environmental engineering could provide ultimate security. Back in Mesopotamia, the application of river maps to engineering warfare reached a chilling level of precision, particularly in the bitter conflicts between Assyria and Babylon. Assyrian engineers, armed with detailed clay tablet maps of the Tigris and Euphrates, didn't just divert water for temporary tactical advantage, they permanently reconfigured entire watersheds to demonstrate imperial dominance. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib laid siege to Babylon in 689 BC, his forces didn't merely blockade the city, they used their hydrological maps to engineer an environmental catastrophe. The maps showed exactly where to construct massive diversion dams that would redirect the Euphrates River itself away from Babylon's irrigation canals and reservoirs. But Sennacherib went further. His engineers actually dug new channels that deliberately flooded the city's outskirts, using the redirected river to wash away entire districts and undermine the massive defensive walls. This wasn't just military engineering. It was a statement that the Assyrian king commanded the very waters that the Babylonians worshipped as gods. The psychological impact was devastating, demonstrating that no fortification could protect against an enemy who could literally make the river change its course. This practice of intentional flooding as a weapon required astonishingly precise geographic knowledge. To successfully drown an enemy city without also destroying one's own forces or creating uncontrollable flooding required detailed elevation maps showing the exact lay of the land. Assyrian and Babylonian surveyors developed sophisticated leveling instruments to create contour maps that indicated which valleys would naturally channel water toward specific targets and which areas needed artificial dikes to direct the flow. The famous Babylonian world map, though symbolic in many aspects, reflects this engineering mindset, showing the Euphrates flowing through a circular world surrounded by a circular ocean, suggesting their conceptual understanding of water systems as controllable circuits rather than random natural phenomena. This cartographic perspective enabled them to think of rivers not as fixed features but as flexible tools that could be replumbed to serve imperial ambitions. The Romans elevated this engineering approach to an institutional level, creating an entire corps of military engineers whose river maps guided projects that literally reshaped Europe's landscape. Their charts of the Rhine and Danube didn't just note navigation hazards, they documented the geological composition of riverbanks to identify where canals could be most easily dug, calculated soil stability for bridge foundations, and identified quarry sites for construction materials along river routes. This knowledge enabled projects like the 35-mile-long Fossa Drusiana Canal, dug by Roman engineers to connect the Rhine River to the North Sea, allowing their fleets to bypass treacherous North Sea storms and launch surprise attacks on Germanic tribes from unexpected directions. Similarly, their detailed maps of the Danube's floodplains allowed them to construct a series of overflow channels and retention basins that could be deliberately opened to flood approaching enemy armies, a hydraulic defense system that turned the river itself into an active participant in Rome's border security. What made these ancient engineering projects so remarkable was their dual nature as both constructive and destructive acts. The same canal that brought life-giving water to agricultural regions could also be used to deny water to enemies or flood their land. The same reservoir that ensured a city's water security during peace could become a weapon of mass destruction during war by being deliberately breached. This ambiguity forced ancient engineers to think in terms of systems rather than single-purpose structures, creating hydraulic networks that could be reconfigured for different strategic needs as circumstances changed. Their river maps thus became dynamic documents showing not just what the landscape was, but what it could become through calculated intervention blueprints for environmental transformation that could mean the difference between empire and oblivion. Beyond their practical applications in engineering and logistics, river maps possessed a more subtle yet equally powerful dimension as instruments of psychological domination. In the theater of ancient geopolitics, controlling the narrative was often as crucial as controlling the territory, and few things conveyed mastery more effectively than the confident display of a detailed chart. When a conqueror could unfurl a parchment that revealed the intimate secrets of a land, the very arteries that gave it life, he was communicating something far more profound than mere geographic knowledge. He was demonstrating a form of omniscience that suggested resistance was not just futile, but unnatural, positioning himself not merely as a military victor, but as someone who had already deciphered the fundamental code of the world his enemies inhabited. The Achaemenid Persians under rulers like Cyrus the Great perfected this cartographic theater of intimidation. Following a conquest, Persian satraps would often summon local chieftains and present them with stunningly accurate maps of their own river systems, documents that sometimes contained details the locals themselves had never systematically recorded. This was no act of educational generosity. It was a calculated psychological maneuver. The message was unmistakable. We know your land, its lifeblood, its vulnerabilities, and its seasonal moods better than you do. Your home holds no secrets from us, and therefore offers you no refuge. This display of geographic omniscience could shatter the will to resist more effectively than any display of military force. Why rebel against an empire that has already mapped the hidden ford your grandfather showed you, or the secluded tributary where your people secretly fish? The map transformed the relationship from one of conqueror and conquered to one of comprehensive, inescapable knowledge and ignorance. The land itself, through its charted representation, was made to testify against its inhabitants, becoming an unwilling ally of the new regime. In China, this psychological application of river cartography took on a distinct philosophical character deeply tied to the mandate of heaven. The Yellow River, with its catastrophic and unpredictable floods, was viewed not just as a physical challenge but as a cosmological one, a manifestation of chaotic natural forces that challenged the very order of civilization. Emperors, therefore, did not simply manage the river. They performed the role of its divine tamer. Elaborately illustrated maps of the Yellow River and its extensive dike systems were produced not for military generals but for public consumption and diplomatic display. These documents were less practical guides and more works of propaganda, depicting the emperor and his engineers as master calligraphers patiently inscribing lines of order upon the chaotic scroll of nature. The maps showed the river not as it was, but as it should be, canalized, disciplined, and obediently flowing within its human prescribed channels. By publicly claiming cartographic control over the unruly river, a dynasty was visually asserting its moral right to rule, demonstrating its ability to impose harmony between heaven and earth, and thus legitimizing its authority over both the landscape and the people living on it. This symbolic power extended into the realm of international diplomacy, where the presentation of a map could serve as either a veiled threat or a generous offer of protection. A smaller kingdom situated along a major river might receive a beautifully rendered map of that waterway from a powerful neighbor, a gift that carried a deeply ambiguous meaning. On one hand, it could be interpreted as a benevolent gesture, showing concern for the kingdom's flood security and trade routes. On the other, It was an unmistakable demonstration that the larger power possessed the knowledge to control, divert, or flood that river at will, making the smaller kingdom's survival contingent on continued good relations. The map became a silent, elegant ultimatum, allowing the stronger state to communicate its power without the vulgarity of an explicit threat. It was geopolitics rendered in ink and vellum, where the most sophisticated negotiations happened not with words but with lines on a chart. The psychological impact was particularly devastating when applied against nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures, whose identity was deeply intertwined with the mystique of the unknown landscape. For steppe peoples like the Scythians or various Germanic tribes, their greatest strategic asset was often their territory's intimidating unfamiliarity, its trackless forests, unmapped swamps, and unpredictable rivers that had swallowed invading armies for generations. When a Roman expeditionary force arrived not with hesitant steps but with confident marches directly to the best river crossings, or when a Persian envoy could name remote tributaries that only tribal elders knew, it fundamentally undermined this defensive advantage. The magic of the land was dispelled by the cold certainty of the map, the spirits of the river, the protective genius of the forest. These mystical defenses crumbled before the rational, measured lines of the chart. The conqueror, armed with such documents, appeared not as a man but as a force of nature himself, inevitable and all-knowing. This transformation of cartography from a technical tool into an instrument of soft power represents one of the most sophisticated developments in ancient strategy. It recognized that the ultimate victory is not just over armies but over minds, not just over territory but over the very idea of resistance. A well-drawn river map could achieve what 10,000 soldiers might not. It could convince a people that their world was already understood, measured, and contained within the archives of their new masters, and that their future lay not in defiantly defending the old mysteries, but in accepting their place within a new, meticulously mapped order. The battlefield had expanded into the human psyche, and the most effective weapon was sometimes not a sword, but a surveyor's line. This obsessive protection of river knowledge created a shadow world of information control that would feel strangely familiar to modern intelligence agencies. In an age without digital encryption, ancient states developed remarkably sophisticated methods to safeguard their hydro-strategic advantages. The very survival of empires could hinge on preventing a single papyrus scroll from falling into the wrong hands, leading to security protocols that treated geographic knowledge with the same seriousness we now apply to nuclear secrets. This wasn't merely about hiding maps in locked rooms. It was about building entire systems of restricted access, coded language, and even deliberate misinformation to ensure that a kingdom's lifeblood, its understanding of waterways, remained exclusively its own. The Egyptian approach to securing the Nile's secrets represents one of history's earliest and most effective classification systems. Within the temple complexes of Thebes and Memphis, specially designated scribes under priestly supervision maintained the master charts of the river. These documents weren't stored with ordinary administrative records, but were kept in sealed crypts accessible only to the pharaoh and his highest-ranking advisors. What made this system particularly effective was its integration with religious authority. The maps were considered not just state secrets but divine knowledge, gifted by the god Hapi who personified the Nile's inundation. This spiritual dimension created a powerful cultural taboo against unauthorized access, as violating the secrecy wasn't merely treason against the pharaoh but sacrilege against the gods themselves. The punishment for such transgressions extended beyond execution to the erasure of one's name from history, ensuring no memory would remain of those who betrayed the river's secrets. Rome institutionalized this secrecy with characteristically brutal efficiency, creating the ancient equivalent of a top-secret clearance system for geographic intelligence. Military maps, particularly those detailing the Rhine and Danube frontiers, were classified as arcana imperii, secrets of state. The production of these documents was centralized under strict control. Teams of army surveyors would collect raw data from the frontiers, but the actual compilation into strategic maps occurred in Rome under the watchful eyes of the emperor's most trusted engineers. Copyists worked in isolated scriptoriums, each specializing in a small section to prevent any single individual from possessing complete knowledge of a river system. Historical accounts suggest that particularly sensitive maps, like those showing proposed invasion routes into Parthia, were sometimes destroyed after a single campaign to eliminate any risk of future leakage. The penalty for losing a map or revealing its contents was not just death for the individual, but often extended to their entire family, a draconian measure that underscored the value placed on this knowledge. Perhaps the most fascinating security measure emerged not from formal state policy, but from the informal practices of those who knew the rivers best, the pilots and boatmen who navigated these waterways daily. In cultures from the Mississippi to the Mekong, experienced river guides developed complex oral traditions for passing on navigational knowledge without committing it to vulnerable written form. These masters of the currents would train apprentices through years of hands-on experience, teaching them to read the water's surface for hidden dangers, to memorize sequences of landmarks, and to feel the river's mood through the steering oar. The famous Mahouts of the Ganges could navigate hundreds of miles of complex waterways without a single written chart, their knowledge encoded in songs, poems, and mnemonic devices that were meaningless to outsiders. This oral cartography created a living, breathing security system where the map existed only in the minds of trusted individuals who could neither be coerced into revealing what they didn't physically possess, nor have their knowledge stolen in a raid on some library. The extreme measures extended to active deception campaigns aimed at polluting the geographic intelligence of rivals. Kingdoms would sometimes deliberately allow false river maps to be stolen by enemy spies, documents that mixed accurate information with catastrophic inaccuracies. A map might correctly show the main channel of a river, but omit a crucial seasonal tributary that provided the only reliable water during dry months, or it might exaggerate the dangers of certain rapids to discourage exploration while secretly noting safe passage routes in coded symbols. The Han Dynasty in China maintained entire departments dedicated to creating these sophisticated forgeries, complete with artificially aged silk and convincing brushwork styles that mimicked those of rival states. The goal was to create confusion and false confidence in enemy commanders, leading them into environmental traps where nature would do the fighting without a single friendly soldier being risked. This culture of hydro-secrecy created a paradoxical relationship between knowledge and power in the ancient world. The most advanced states often left the fewest cartographic records, not because they were ignorant, but because they understood the strategic value of keeping their knowledge secret and ultimately ephemeral. We know from historical accounts that the Phoenicians possessed detailed charts of Mediterranean rivers that allowed their ships to trade and establish colonies from Spain to Lebanon. Yet almost none of these documents survive because they were either destroyed to protect their trade routes or never committed to permanent form in the first place. Similarly, the Viking mastery of European river systems that allowed them to strike deep into the continent is documented mostly through archaeological finds of their ships and settlements, not through surviving maps, suggesting they too protected their geographic intelligence as a crucial military advantage. The silence in the historical record often speaks volumes about how fiercely this knowledge was guarded, reminding us that sometimes the most important documents are those that were never meant to be found. While the clandestine world of map secrecy revolved around deception and protection, these same documents also played a role in the more refined art of statecraft, where a carefully presented chart could achieve what an army could not. In the diplomatic chambers of the ancient world, far from the clamor of battle, river maps transformed from instruments of war into tools of peace, serving as the ultimate arbiters of boundaries and the physical embodiment of negotiated agreements. This transition from the martial to the ministerial represents one of the most sophisticated evolutions in the use of geographic knowledge, where the power to define reality through cartography became the foundation of lasting political order. The aftermath of the cataclysmic Battle of Kadesh between the Egyptians and Hittites provides a powerful example of this diplomatic cartography in action. Following a stalemate that left both mighty empires bloodied and exhausted, negotiators faced the daunting task of establishing a stable border in a region with no obvious natural divisions. Their solution was remarkably modern. They turned to the Orontes River, but not as a simple, unquestioned line on a map. Instead, Egyptian and Hittite surveyors collaborated to create a series of meticulously detailed charts that documented the river's entire course through the disputed territories. These maps went far beyond shorelines. They included annotations on seasonal flow variations, the precise location of fords used by local tribes, and even the distribution of agricultural land on each bank. This joint cartographic project allowed diplomats to negotiate not from ignorance but from a shared, objective understanding of the geography, enabling them to draw a border that considered practical realities like water access for communities and defensible terrain, rather than just abstract claims of ownership. The resulting treaty, one of the oldest surviving peace agreements in history, was as much a product of this collaborative mapping effort as it was of military exhaustion. In the intricate dance of Mauryan diplomacy, river maps served a more subtle and psychological purpose. When envoys from Pataliputra arrived at the court of a smaller neighboring kingdom, the presentation of a beautifully rendered map of the regional river systems was a carefully calibrated gesture loaded with multiple meanings. On one level, it could be framed as an act of generosity, a sharing of valuable hydrological knowledge that could help the recipient kingdom better manage irrigation, predict floods, and improve trade routes. The map might suggest new canal locations or warn of silting problems in their harbors, tangible benefits that demonstrated the Mauryan Empire's role as a benevolent source of wisdom and technological advancement. Yet this apparent gift carried an unmistakable subtext of power. The very act of presenting such a detailed document revealed that the Mauryans already possessed an intimate, comprehensive knowledge of the kingdom's most vital geographic feature. It silently communicated that every city along the riverbanks, every agricultural region dependent on its water, and every potential invasion route via its channels was already known, measured, and catalogued in the imperial archives. The message was clear: resistance was not just militarily futile but geographically ignorant, as the empire already understood the land better than its own inhabitants did. This diplomatic use of cartography extended beyond bilateral relations into the realm of multilateral conferences and territorial disputes between smaller states. In ancient Mesopotamia, city-states like Lagash and Umma, who frequently fought over fertile lands bordering their shared waterways, eventually began employing neutral third-party cartographers to settle their boundary conflicts. These independent surveyors, often scribes from a respected temple complex with no stake in the outcome, would create definitive maps based on physical surveys and historical records. Their authority derived from their perceived objectivity and their technical expertise in accurately representing the landscape. The resulting documents would then be ratified by both parties, sometimes with copies deposited in each city's temple as a sacred guarantee against future violations. This process effectively transferred the dispute from the volatile realm of military confrontation to the more orderly domain of technical measurement and legal agreement, with the map itself serving as the immutable record of the resolution. The cartographer's pen thus replaced the warrior's spear as the instrument for establishing possession, a civilizing shift that recognized the greater long-term value of stable borders over temporary military advantages. The symbolic power of these diplomatic maps was often enhanced through elaborate artistic and ritual elements that elevated them from mere technical documents to objects of almost sacred significance. Borders defined by rivers were frequently illustrated with elaborate depictions of river deities blessing the agreement, visually reinforcing the idea that the natural world itself sanctioned the new arrangement. The act of signing or sealing the map became a public ceremony, sometimes involving oaths sworn upon the very waters the chart represented. In some cultures, copies of the treaty map were ritually immersed in the river to symbolically unite the document with the reality it described, creating a binding connection between the ink on parchment and the water flowing over the land. This ritualistic dimension transformed the map from a simple representation into a powerful fetish of political order, an object whose violation would constitute not just a breach of contract, but a sacrilege against the natural harmony it embodied. Through these very diplomatic applications, river maps ultimately became a universal language of power and order in the ancient world, transcending cultural and linguistic barriers. A Hittite prince and an Egyptian pharaoh, who might have struggled to communicate directly, could both understand the unambiguous message of a line drawn along a river's course on a shared map. A Mauryan emperor could convey both threat and promise to a distant hill chieftain through the selective revelation of geographic knowledge on a silk scroll. This cartographic diplomacy created a framework for stability that allowed trade to flourish, cultural exchange to develop, and resources to be managed more efficiently across political boundaries. The mapmaker, in this context, emerged as not just a technician but as a peacemaker and a nation builder, whose carefully drawn lines could prevent conflicts, solidify alliances, and give tangible form to the abstract idea of peaceful coexistence. In the silent eloquence of these documents, we see the ancient world groping toward a system of international relations based on shared knowledge and mutually recognized boundaries, proving that the same intelligence that could guide an invasion could also pave the road to lasting peace. The story of river cartography is not just one of increasing geographic knowledge, but of revolutionary technological leaps that transformed how empires saw and thus controlled their world. The journey began with the most basic of materials, clay and reed. In Mesopotamia, scribes would press cuneiform symbols into wet clay tablets, creating the first durable river charts. These were practical, heavy documents that could be transported but not easily altered. A commander in the field couldn't update a clay map if he discovered a new sandbar. He needed a new tablet. This limitation began to change with the Egyptian adoption of papyrus. Lightweight, scrollable, and capable of being redrawn, papyrus maps introduced a new era of flexibility. A general could now carry an entire library of river charts in a single case, annotating them in real time with notes on enemy positions, changed water levels, or new canal constructions. This shift from static to dynamic mapping was as significant as the move from stone tablets to paper in later centuries, enabling a faster, more responsive form of military planning. Perhaps the most transformative innovation came from ancient China with the invention of the floating compass during the Han Dynasty. While often associated with ocean navigation, its earliest and most crucial military applications were fluvial. Charting the powerful and unpredictable currents of the Yellow River was a nightmare for cartographers. A boat could be swept miles off course while taking depth measurements, rendering any resulting map instantly obsolete. The compass changed everything by providing a constant, reliable reference point against the river's chaotic flow. It allowed surveyors to accurately track their exact position and direction. They could now create maps that didn't just show where the river was, but precisely how it behaved, mapping the complex swirls of currents, identifying the exact lines of fastest flow for rapid transport, and pinpointing the calm back eddies ideal for ambushing enemy supply barges. This technology turned the river from a mysterious, living entity into a measurable, predictable system, its secrets laid bare by a simple magnetic needle floating in a bowl of water. Simultaneously, on the other side of the world, Greco-Roman scholars were revolutionizing cartography through mathematics. While earlier maps were often impressionistic, showing key features without strict spatial relationships, Greek thinkers like Ptolemy introduced the concepts of scale, coordinate systems, and projection. This was a move from artistic interpretation toward scientific representation. A Roman military map of the Danube, drawn to a consistent scale, allowed a logistics officer to calculate not just that a supply barge needed to travel from point A to point B, but exactly how many miles that journey was and how long it would take given the current's known speed. Grid systems allowed for incredibly precise notation of features. Instead of a vague notation like "rapids here," a Roman engineer could mark a specific grid square with a symbol indicating the severity of the rapids, the season they were most dangerous, and even the recommended type of vessel to navigate them. This mathematical rigor eliminated the guesswork from river campaigning, turning command decisions into calculated equations of time, distance, and environmental force. These technological revolutions did not occur in isolation. They spread through the arteries of empire and conquest, creating a fascinating cross-pollination of cartographic knowledge. Alexander the Great's campaigns became a vector for this exchange. As his armies marched from Greece through Persia and into India, they were accompanied by a corps of surveyors and mapmakers known as the Bematists. Their mission was to measure every step of the journey, but their greatest legacy was the fusion of techniques they facilitated. Greek geometric principles met the sophisticated administrative cartography of the Persians, which in turn encountered the extensive hydrological knowledge of the Indus Valley civilizations. In the libraries of conquered cities, Alexander's scholars absorbed local river maps, translating their content and integrating their insights into a new, hybrid form of cartography that was more accurate and comprehensive than anything that had come before. This knowledge then flowed back westward, influencing map-making across the Hellenistic world and later Rome. The quest for the perfect strategic map became a powerful, if unintended, engine of scientific and cultural exchange, proving that the tools of war could sometimes bridge the divides between civilizations. Yet this fusion of the divine and the geographic was far more than mere decoration. It was a sophisticated psychological tool that shaped military decisions in profound ways. When a Roman general like Julius Caesar prepared to cross the Rhine into Germanic territory, his consultation of the river maps was not a purely technical exercise. Those charts, often drawn on precious vellum, didn't just indicate depth and current. They were adorned with illustrations of Father Rhine himself, a powerful deity whose favor was essential for a safe passage. The act of crossing thus became a religious ritual as much as a tactical maneuver. Sacrifices would be made on the riverbank, prayers offered to the god depicted on the very map being used for planning. This ceremony served a crucial dual purpose. It reassured the superstitious soldiers that their commander had secured divine approval for a dangerous operation, and it psychologically framed the river not as a neutral obstacle, but as a conscious entity that had been appeased. The map was the script for this performance, blending hard data with spiritual assurance to bolster the army's morale before a potentially demoralizing operation in unknown lands. This practice of seeking divine permission through cartographic ritual was not unique to Rome. In ancient India, the campaign maps used by kings and generals navigating the Ganges River were often less technical documents and more objects of veneration. The river was not charted as a simple waterway but illustrated as the goddess Ganga, descending from the heavens through the matted hair of the god Shiva and flowing across the earthly realm. A general planning a riverine campaign would first seek blessings from priests who could interpret the will of the goddess as shown in the map's symbolic features. A particularly treacherous whirlpool might be seen as her displeasure, while a calm, wide bend indicated her favor. This spiritual cartography could dictate the very timing and route of a military expedition. An army might delay a crossing for weeks, not because of poor weather or enemy activity, but because the configuration of the river on their sacred map was deemed inauspicious. The map thus became a conduit for divine will, its practical information inseparable from its mythological narrative, ensuring that military ambition remained checked by spiritual respect. Perhaps the most dramatic example of myth influencing grand strategy through cartography was the Persian king Xerxes' campaign against Greece. His army faced the daunting challenge of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. Greek mythology and local lore had long held this passage to be a sacred boundary, a place where the god Poseidon himself guarded the division between continents. To cross it with an army was not just a military operation, it was an act of hubris, a direct challenge to divine order. The Persian maps of the region would have reflected this belief, likely marking the strait with symbols of its sacred and untouchable status. Xerxes, however, famously chose to defy this cartographic taboo. He ordered his engineers to construct not one, but two pontoon bridges across the Hellespont. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes did not interpret it as a simple natural disaster. He saw it as a personal insult from the deity of the waterway. In a stunning act of symbolic countermapping, he reportedly had the waters of the Hellespont whipped and branded with hot irons as punishment, a ritual meant to subjugate the divine spirit of the place to his imperial will. This was more than the tantrum of a tyrant. It was a calculated performance for his troops and his enemies. By publicly humiliating the god of the strait, Xerxes was effectively redrawing the mythological map, asserting that his power transcended even the most ancient divine boundaries. The successful second bridging was therefore a victory of both engineering and ideology, proving that a ruler's will, when projected onto a map, could literally reshape the perceived limits of the possible. These symbolic layers embedded within ancient river maps created a powerful feedback loop between belief and geography. A place marked on a map as the dwelling of a river spirit would be avoided by scouts, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that kept that area unexplored and mysterious. Conversely, a ford blessed by a favorable omen on a map would become a well-trodden military crossroads, its reputation for safety growing with each successful use. The map didn't just describe reality, it actively participated in creating it, weaving together observable facts and deep-seated cultural beliefs into a single authoritative document. A commander was therefore not just reading a chart of depths and distances, he was navigating a landscape thick with meaning, where every bend in the river could hold a potential ally or adversary from the spiritual realm. This complex interplay gave ancient warfare a dimension utterly foreign to modern conflict, where success depended on appeasing the gods of the land as much as outmaneuvering the enemy on it. The greatest generals were those who could master both the practical and the symbolic information on their maps, understanding that to conquer a territory, one first had to conquer its story. This fascinating divergence in how ancient civilizations weaponized their rivers reveals a profound philosophical split between East and West, a fundamental difference in how humans perceived their relationship with the natural world. In the Mediterranean mind, best exemplified by Rome, rivers were seen as features to be integrated into a system of order. The Roman ideal was to impose their will upon the landscape through engineering that worked in concert with nature's existing pathways. Their maps of the Rhine or Danube were essentially blueprints for control, meticulously documenting how these waterways could serve the empire's logistical needs. They charted every ford where a legion could cross without losing formation, every calm stretch of water suitable for a temporary bridge of boats, and every deep channel where supply barges could reliably navigate. The river, in this view, was a resource to be harnessed and a boundary to be fortified, a natural extension of the Roman road network that moved men and material with unparalleled efficiency. Their strategy was one of dominance through incorporation, bending the river's inherent utility to the unyielding will of the empire without seeking to fundamentally alter its essence. A Roman general looked at a river and saw a highway or a moat. His maps were tools for navigation and defense, ensuring the empire's machine could flow smoothly across the landscape. Conversely, in ancient China, particularly under the Qin and Han dynasties, the relationship with rivers was far more dynamic and interventionist. The Chinese philosophical tradition, with its concepts of yin and yang and the dynamic balance of forces, saw nature not as a system to be integrated with, but as a powerful flow of energy to be channeled and redirected. This was especially true for the Yellow River, a volatile and terrifying force nicknamed China's Sorrow for its devastating floods. Chinese strategists didn't just want to use the river, they sought to master its very nature, to turn its destructive potential into a precise instrument of state policy. Their maps were therefore completely different in character. Where Roman charts showed depths and crossing points, Chinese silk scrolls detailed the complex web of dikes, levees, and irrigation canals that attempted to tame the river's flow. These documents were less about navigation and more about engineering control, highlighting weak points in the system that could be deliberately breached to unleash catastrophic flooding on an enemy downstream. The Chinese approach was one of active manipulation, a belief that with sufficient understanding and technical skill, the awesome power of nature could be stored, aimed, and released like a weapon. A Chinese commander looked at a river and saw a sleeping dragon. His maps were instructions on how to provoke it to destroy his enemies. This stark contrast in application stemmed from deeper cultural and environmental realities. Rome expanded across a diverse landscape of relatively predictable, stable rivers like the Tiber, the Rhine, and the Danube. These waterways were reliable partners in conquest, their flows fairly consistent and their courses well-defined. The primary challenge was logistical, not existential. China's heartland, however, was dominated by the incredibly unpredictable and ferocious Yellow River, which could change its course overnight and wipe out centuries of agricultural development with a single flood. This constant environmental threat necessitated a more aggressive, centralized, and technically sophisticated approach to water management. The state's very legitimacy depended on its ability to control the river, making the engineering knowledge contained in those maps a matter of dynastic survival. The need to control the Yellow River bred a unique form of hydraulic despotism, where the power to command water equated to the power to command life itself. a concept far less pronounced in the more geographically stable Roman West. The legacy of these opposing philosophies is written not just in ancient scrolls but in the very geography they sought to control. The Roman reliance on rivers as fixed highways and frontiers left a lasting imprint on European history, where rivers like the Rhine continued to serve as cultural and political boundaries for millennia. The Chinese strategy of transformative manipulation created a landscape of immense human effort, a network of canals and dikes that literally reshaped the North China Plain. One empire sought to build its order upon the natural world, while the other sought to rebuild the natural world to suit its order. This comparison shows us that there was no single path to power in the ancient world. Human ingenuity, when faced with the universal challenge of controlling water, produced brilliantly divergent solutions, one favoring the sword and the bridge, the other the shovel and the flood. Both were devastatingly effective, proving that the greatest strategic advantage often lies not in the resources you possess, but in the unique way your culture teaches you to see them. Yet the fall of Rome did not mean the loss of this hard-won hydro-strategic wisdom. Instead, the knowledge seeped into the foundations of new powers rising across Europe and Asia, who quickly grasped that river mastery was the key to legitimacy and expansion. Medieval warfare, often misrepresented as a chaotic clash of brute force, was in fact deeply informed by geographic intelligence, with ambitious rulers commissioning elaborate maps that were every bit as strategic as those of their Roman predecessors. Charlemagne's brutal Saxon wars provide a compelling case study in this continuity. Facing fierce Germanic tribes who used the dense forests and winding rivers of their homeland as a vast natural fortress, Charlemagne's success hinged on his ability to overcome this environmental advantage. His campaign planners, likely drawing on surviving Roman charts and new intelligence from monastic travelers, created detailed itineraries of the Rhine and Weser river systems. These documents were less about artistic representation and more about practical logistics, identifying where shallow draft boats could land Frankish cavalry close to Saxon strongholds, and which tributaries could be used to rapidly move supplies deep into hostile territory. This cartographic insight allowed Charlemagne to bypass the trackless woods that had swallowed previous Roman armies, using the waterways as hidden corridors to strike at the Saxon heartland with shocking speed and sustain his forces during grueling winter campaigns that eventually broke Saxon resistance through relentless, well-supplied pressure. Across the continent, the Byzantine Empire acted as the crucial custodian of ancient cartographic knowledge, preserving and refining Greco-Roman hydrological expertise within the scriptoriums of Constantinople. Their thematic maps, though often focused on administration, held immense military value. Byzantine generals defending the empire's long Danube frontier against waves of invaders from the steppes relied on these documents to coordinate their defense. The maps detailed not only the river's main channel but also the complex network of seasonal streams and marshlands that flanked it, allowing Byzantine flotillas to navigate these peripheral waters and launch devastating raids against Avar or Bulgar camps that believed themselves safe from naval attack. This ability to project power from an unexpected aquatic direction, guided by superior maps, allowed the outnumbered Byzantines to hold the line for centuries, proving that geographic intelligence could be a formidable force multiplier even for an empire in gradual retreat. The Crusades unleashed a massive and chaotic exchange of geographic knowledge, as European knights suddenly found themselves campaigning in a landscape utterly alien to their experience. Their initial disastrous marches across Anatolia, dying of thirst and ambush, were a brutal lesson in the cost of poor planning. The later, more successful campaigns were those guided by updated river charts, often acquired from Italian merchant navies who had traded in the Levant for generations or provided by Armenian Christian allies. These maps of the Jordan, the Orontes, and the Euphrates were lifelines for the Crusader states. They revealed vital freshwater sources in the arid landscape, identified defensible river junctions where castles like Crac des Chevaliers could be built to control movement, and outlined the logistical routes that connected the fragile coastal kingdoms to their inland strongholds. The survival of Outremer for nearly 200 years was a testament not just to martial fervor, but to the gradual, painful acquisition of the hydro-strategic intelligence needed to sustain a European presence in the Middle East. No force, however, demonstrated the terrifying offensive potential of riverine mobility better than the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors. Hailing from the steppes, the Mongols were masters of the open plain, but their conquest of China, Persia, and Eastern Europe required them to adapt to a world crisscrossed by major rivers. They did so with breathtaking speed and pragmatism. Mongol tumans, or armies, incorporated Chinese engineers who possessed detailed maps of the Yellow River and Yangtze systems, and Persian navigators who knew the secrets of the Oxus and the Tigris. This knowledge allowed the Mongols to execute campaigns that seemed logistically impossible. In their invasion of Eastern Europe, they used charts of the Volga and Danube basins to coordinate wide, sweeping maneuvers across thousands of miles, with separate army groups using rivers as guiding lines to reunite at precise times and locations, trapping their bewildered enemies between them. Their famous pontoon bridges, constructed with incredible speed from pre-prepared materials carried on campaign, were built at points their maps indicated were optimal for surprise and speed, not where local defenders expected a crossing. The Mongols didn't just use rivers, they absorbed the cartographic knowledge of every culture they conquered, weaving it into an unmatched strategic system that allowed them to dominate the varied landscapes of most of the known world. The dawn of the early modern period and the invention of the printing press did not diminish the strategic value of river maps, it democratized and enhanced it. Printed maps, though still expensive, could be reproduced and distributed to a wider circle of commanders, creating a more standardized and reliable basis for planning large-scale operations. The Ottoman Empire's relentless advance up the Danube Valley into the heart of Europe was a masterclass in this new era of printed cartography. Ottoman engineers produced increasingly accurate maps of the Danube's entire length, which were used to plan the logistics for their massive armies and the powerful river fleets that supported them. The fall of Belgrade and the eventual siege of Vienna were not achieved by brute force alone, but through a sophisticated understanding of how to use the great river as a supply route to move massive siege guns and shiploads of grain to sustain their operations hundreds of miles from their base. Their European adversaries, initially dismissive of the Ottoman threat, were slowly forced to respond in kind, leading to a cartographic arms race on the Danube that would define the struggle between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires for centuries. This enduring thread, connecting the clay tablets of Assyria to the printed charts of the Renaissance, reveals a fundamental truth of military history. While weapons evolved from the spear to the cannon and armor gave way to gunpowder, the strategic advantage granted by controlling the narrative of the landscape remained constant. The commander who could look at a river and see not a barrier but a highway, a weapon, a source of sustenance, and a psychological tool, held an edge that no technological innovation could easily negate. The river map was the key that unlocked this perspective, a silent partner to empire that whispered the secrets of the land to those who knew how to listen, proving that the flow of water and the flow of history are inextricably linked. For centuries, the strategic use of river maps was a compelling theory woven from scattered historical accounts and logical deduction, a ghost in the machine of ancient warfare that we could only imagine. Then the spades of archaeologists began to turn up the earth, and those ghosts materialized into breathtaking, tangible reality. These weren't just artifacts, they were time capsules containing the very thought processes of long-dead generals, the cold, hard data that once decided the fate of millions. Each discovery serves as a direct confrontation with the past, forcing us to replace speculation with certainty and granting us the privilege of reading from the same playbook as history's greatest strategists. Consider the Babylonian world map, a fascinating and somewhat mystical clay tablet dating to the 6th century BC. At first glance, it appears more symbolic than practical, showing the earth as a flat disk surrounded by a bitter ocean, with Babylon sitting proudly at the center of the universe. But to dismiss it as mere mythology is to miss its profound strategic purpose. The map doesn't just show water, it meticulously depicts the Euphrates River flowing south from the northern mountains through Babylon and down into the southern marshes. This wasn't a guide for sailors, it was a political statement of control, a cartographic declaration that the empire's lifeblood and its authority flowed along that single, vital waterway. For a subject people or a rival king to see such a map was to understand that Babylon claimed dominion over the very source of life itself, making the document a powerful tool of psychological domination as much as a geographic one. The Roman approach to cartography was true to form, breathtakingly systematic and practical. The famous Peutingers table, a medieval copy of a much earlier Roman original, is a stunning example of this ethos. This elongated scroll, over 22 feet long, isn't a map in the modern sense with accurate scales and shapes. Instead, it's a schematic diagram of the entire Roman road network, but crucially, it integrates every major river across the empire. The Rhine, the Danube, the Nile, and the Euphrates are all clearly marked, not for their scenic beauty but as integral parts of the imperial logistics machine. The map shows where roads ford the rivers, where bridges were constructed, and which waterways could take over where the roads left off. A military planner in Rome could use this single document to chart a course for a legion from Britain to Mesopotamia, knowing exactly where they would need to build boats, where they could cross safely, and how to keep supplies flowing the entire way. It is the ultimate expression of Rome's bureaucratic genius, reducing the vast, chaotic complexity of 3 continents into a manageable, color-coded itinerary of conquest and control. In China, the dry, sealed tombs of the Han Dynasty aristocracy have yielded treasures of a different kind, incredibly detailed maps painted on silk. The discovery of maps in the Mawangdui tombs was a watershed moment in archaeological history. One particularly stunning example charts a significant portion of the Yellow River and its tributaries with a level of accuracy that is almost shocking for its time. But what makes it a military document are the annotations. Along the riverbanks, tiny characters label not just cities, but military garrisons, watchtowers, and supply depots. Different symbols likely indicated the quality of the landing beaches for troops or the locations of government granaries that could provision an army on the move. This wasn't a map for merchants, it was a dashboard for imperial management and military mobilization. It shows a centralized state that so thoroughly understood the strategic value of its geography that it could direct its power with precision along the natural channels formed by its rivers, putting the destructive and life-giving force of the Yellow River at the service of the emperor's ambition. Even the sands of Egypt have given up their secrets, though often in more subtle ways. While no papyrus scroll detailing a full campaign has survived entirely intact, the walls of pharaonic tombs are filled with indirect evidence. Scenes of tribute from conquered Nubian kingdoms often include carefully rendered images of the Nile's treacherous cataracts, the very obstacles Egyptian armies had to overcome to project their power southward. Other tomb paintings show scribes presenting the pharaoh with scrolls that undoubtedly contain tax records and harvest yields, information that was intrinsically tied to the Nile's inundation charts. To hold power in Egypt was to predict the flood, and to predict the flood was to possess the ultimate strategic map. This knowledge allowed the pharaoh to plan campaigns when the river was high and his fleet could travel freely, while his Nubian enemies were isolated by the very same waters. These artistic representations confirm what the historical records imply, that the Egyptians didn't just live on the Nile, they thought in terms of its currents and seasons, using that knowledge as the foundation for all military and economic planning. The impact of these discoveries ripples far beyond the academic world. They fundamentally alter our understanding of ancient capabilities. Every time a new fragment is unearthed, a surveyor's tool in a Roman fort, a clay tablet in a Mesopotamian palace archive detailing canal dimensions, it adds another piece to the puzzle. We now know that when Alexander the Great marched into India, he likely did so with maps based on Persian intelligence that was itself centuries old. We understand that the success of the Mongol armies was due not just to their horsemanship, but to their ruthless incorporation of Chinese engineers who knew how to bridge any river in their path. These artifacts dissolve the illusion of ancient warfare as a simple clash of brute force, revealing it instead as a sophisticated contest of information. The general who could see the battlefield not just as a plot of land but as a dynamic system of waterways, obstacles, and resources held an advantage that often proved decisive. To hold these maps today is to finally see the world through their eyes, to comprehend the calculated genius that turned the flow of a river into the tide of empire. But this terrifying power to command rivers came with a profound moral burden that ancient strategists were only beginning to grasp. When an empire decides to weaponize the very environment that sustains life, it crosses a threshold that forever blurs the line between military victory and collective catastrophe. The deliberate breaching of a dike or the strategic diversion of a river might destroy an enemy army in the short term, but it also unleashes a cascade of suffering that inevitably falls heaviest on the most vulnerable civilians who depend on that water for their survival. A farmer tilling his field downstream from a battlefield has no stake in the conflict between empires, yet he and his family would be the first to perish when the engineered floodwaters wash away their home, their crops, and their very means of existence. This form of environmental warfare transformed entire regions into sacrifice zones, where the land itself was rendered barren and poisonous for generations, long after the triumphant generals had marched away. The historical record offers chilling examples of this brutal calculus. The kin strategy of breaking the Yellow River's dikes against the state of Y wasn't just a tactical maneuver. It was an act of hydrological terror that drowned soldiers and civilians alike, submerging cities and prime agricultural land under tons of silt. The Assyrian practice of diverting water to starve out rebellious cities didn't distinguish between combatants and the women, children, and elderly trapped inside the walls. These actions represent a form of total war that makes no pretense of discrimination, using the fundamental necessities of life, water, and food as instruments of coercion and punishment. The ancient world lacked our modern framework of international law, but we see in contemporary accounts from philosophers and historians a clear unease with these tactics. The Roman writer Seneca, among others, expressed a moral revulsion toward commanders who would destroy the land that must eventually feed both victor and vanquished, recognizing that such victories were ultimately Pyrrhic, poisoning the well from which all must eventually drink. This historical precedent forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethics of knowledge itself. The geographic intelligence contained in those river maps was neutral. It was the application of that knowledge for indiscriminate destruction that crossed an ethical line. The same map that could show where to build a canal to prevent famine could also show the weakest point in a levee to cause one. This duality echoes powerfully in our modern world, where satellite imagery and climate data can be used to predict droughts and coordinate humanitarian aid, or they can be used to identify agricultural vulnerabilities in rival nations for the purpose of economic warfare or coercion. The ancient struggle reminds us that the power to understand a complex system like a river basin also brings the power to dismantle it, and that such power demands a proportional sense of moral responsibility. Furthermore, the consequences of this ancient environmental warfare extended far beyond the immediate human toll, triggering ecological death spirals that could last for centuries. A deliberately salinized field from intentional flooding doesn't just mean one bad harvest. It can mean the permanent loss of arable land as salt accumulates in the soil. A river forced into a new channel can lead to the collapse of entire fisheries and the desertification of wetlands that once supported diverse ecosystems and human communities. These were not surgical strikes but blunt, traumatic interventions into the environmental fabric, whose aftershocks rippled through the food web and the climate itself. The empires that wielded these weapons often discovered too late that they had crippled the very regions they sought to rule, inheriting a broken land incapable of generating the wealth and stability needed to maintain their power. They won the battle but lost the peace, becoming the ultimate victims of their own geographic arrogance. This moral dimension adds a crucial layer of tragedy to our understanding of ancient strategy. It reveals that the greatest cost of empire was often borne not by the opposing armies, but by the land and its people, who became collateral damage in a game of thrones played out with water and maps. The silent testimony of abandoned cities and salted earth stands as a permanent rebuke to the brilliance of the generals who orchestrated these hydrological attacks, a reminder that true strategy must account for the long-term health of the human and natural systems it seeks to control. The river maps, therefore, are not just records of conquest, they are also archives of profound loss, documenting the moment when human ingenuity in understanding nature was perverted into the capacity for its wholesale destruction. The strategies etched onto those ancient papyrus scrolls and clay tablets never truly vanished. They simply evolved, finding new life in the digital glow of satellite imagery and hydrological databases. Today, the control of great river systems remains a central, often explosive, issue in global politics, proving that the fundamental equation of power hasn't changed. Whoever commands the water commands the future. The tools are more sophisticated, but the game is eerily familiar, a timeless contest where geographic knowledge is still the ultimate currency of influence and intimidation. Consider the Nile, the same river that pharaohs once mapped to predict harvests and plan invasions, is now the subject of a tense standoff between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile is a modern act of hydraulic empire building, a monumental project that promises energy and development for one nation while potentially threatening the water security of downstream countries. This isn't a conflict fought with spears and arrows, but with engineering studies and water flow models. Each nation employs advanced satellite mapping to monitor the dam's reservoir levels and riverbank alterations, while supercomputers run simulations to predict the impact of various filling scenarios. The negotiations are a direct echo of ancient diplomatic struggles, where detailed charts of the river's flow are presented not on papyrus, but in PowerPoint presentations, each side using its own geographic data to assert claims and leverage concessions. The underlying dynamic is pure Bronze Age realpolitik. Controlling the source means controlling the people who depend on it. Half a world away in Southeast Asia, a similar drama unfolds on the Mekong River. China's ambitious dam construction projects on the upper reaches of the Mekong have granted it unprecedented control over the river's lifeblood. By meticulously mapping the entire basin and manipulating the water flow, China can strategically release water to flatter its allies during dry seasons or withhold it to pressure downstream neighbors like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. This modern-day hydraulic hegemony allows China to influence agricultural output, riverine trade, and the ecological health of a region inhabited by tens of millions, all without firing a single shot. It's a 21st century manifestation of the same strategy employed by Mesopotamian kings who diverted canals to subjugate rival city-states, updated with satellite telemetry and real-time flow sensors. The weapon is environmental and economic, but the blueprint was drawn millennia ago. This historical lens also brings the complex tensions in the South China Sea into sharper focus. While often framed as a dispute over islands and shipping lanes, a significant undercurrent is the control of rivers themselves. Major rivers like the Pearl River in China and the Red River in Vietnam deposit massive amounts of sediment into the sea, gradually changing the underwater topography and, by extension, the legal claims to exclusive economic zones. The nations surrounding this contested water are engaged in a frantic race of cartographic capture, using advanced bathymetric mapping to chart every underwater ridge and river delta outflow. By building artificial islands on strategically located shoals, they are effectively attempting to redirect the narrative of the map, creating new facts on the water to support their territorial ambitions. This is a high-tech version of planting a flag on a newly discovered river mouth, using dredgers and concrete instead of wooden posts, but the objective is identical: to claim sovereignty by controlling the geographic story. Even the age-old conflict over the Tigris and Euphrates rivers continues to mirror its ancient origins. Turkey's southeastern Anatolia project, a vast network of dams on the headwaters of these historic rivers, has dramatically reduced the water flow into Syria and Iraq. This modern engineering feat gives Ankara the power to shape the agricultural and economic stability of its downstream neighbors, a form of leverage that is straight out of the Assyrian playbook. The subsequent water scarcity fuels social unrest and becomes a weapon in ongoing conflicts, with control of local dams and irrigation channels becoming key tactical objectives for various factions within those countries. The satellite images that reveal dwindling reservoirs and parched farmlands are the contemporary equivalent of the clay tablet maps that once showed diverted canals, both serving as stark evidence of how control of a river's map translates directly into control over life and death for those living along its banks. This enduring relevance of ancient hydro strategy forces a crucial recognition. The competition for water is not a temporary crisis but a permanent feature of human civilization. The same geographic logic that guided Roman legions along the Danube now guides policy in boardrooms and government ministries. The maps have changed, but their purpose remains constant: to provide the intelligence needed to secure resources, project power, and outmaneuver rivals. In understanding how Thutmose III used the Nile or how Qin engineers weaponized the Yellow River, we gain more than just historical insight. We acquire a decoder ring for the headlines of today, realizing that the flow of water and the flow of history are, and always will be, inextricably linked. Behind every line inked on those precious river maps stood not a king or a general, but a figure we too often forget: the cartographer. These were the unsung heroes of empire, the quiet masters of measurement whose pens were indeed as mighty as any sword. Imagine the immense pressure they worked under, tasked with translating the chaotic, living reality of a river into a precise, reliable document that could make or break a military campaign. Their work was a dangerous blend of art, science, and sheer exploration, often conducted on the very edges of the known world, far from the safety of royal courts. They weren't just draftsmen, they were intelligence operatives, engineers, and diplomats all rolled into one, braving hostile territories, unfamiliar diseases, and the constant threat of capture to bring back the geographic secrets that fueled imperial ambitions. Consider the incredible challenges they faced simply to gather their data. Before a single line could be drawn, these individuals had to physically journey into the unknown. A Roman agrimensor or surveyor assigned to map the Danube frontier would be part of a small military detachment moving through dense Germanic forests. His tools: a groma for sighting straight lines, a Corabates leveling instrument, and calibrated chains for measurement, were cumbersome and difficult to use in unpredictable terrain. His work was methodical and painstaking, requiring him to take countless measurements of river width, depth, and current speed, all while knowing that a misplaced decimal or a misidentified landmark could later lead an entire legion into a fatal trap. The local tribes, understandably suspicious of these outsiders methodically charting their homeland, would have seen these surveyors not as scholars, but as the vanguard of an invading force, making their mission incredibly perilous. Theirs was a life of meticulous calculation conducted under the constant shadow of sudden, violent death. The intellectual giants of cartography, figures like the Greek geographer Claudius Ptolemy, worked in slightly safer but no less pressurized environments. While Ptolemy himself may not have ventured far from the library at Alexandria, his work synthesized the accounts of countless explorers and military scouts into a coherent system for representing the world. His seminal work, the Geographia, introduced concepts like latitude and longitude and devised methods of projection that attempted to portray the spherical Earth on a flat surface. This wasn't just academic exercise, it provided a mathematical framework that could make maps more accurate and comparable. A Roman general planning a campaign could now, in theory, align a map of the Rhine from one source with a map of the Nile from another, creating a broader strategic understanding of the empire's frontiers. Ptolemy's genius was in creating a universal language of space, but his theories were built upon the raw, often bloody data collected by those anonymous operatives in the field. In the East, figures like the Chinese explorer and diplomat Zhang Qian played an equally vital role, though his contributions were of a different nature. Sent by the Han Emperor Wu on a diplomatic mission to Central Asia, Zhang Qian was captured and held hostage for over a decade. Rather than succumbing, he used his time to become a meticulous observer, mentally mapping the routes, cultures, and crucially, the river systems of the regions he passed through. Upon his eventual return, his detailed reports provided the Han court with its first reliable intelligence about the lands west of the empire, including the flow of the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers. This information was immediately put to strategic use, not for immediate invasion, but for establishing trade routes and alliances that would eventually allow the Han to outflank their nomadic enemies, the Xiongnu. Zhang Qian's story highlights that the cartographer's most important tool wasn't always a measuring instrument, it was an observant mind and a resilient spirit, turning 13 years of captivity into an intelligence coup that reshaped China's understanding of the world. The production of the final maps themselves was a specialized craft shrouded in secrecy. In Egypt, the master charts of the Nile were drawn by a select class of scribes who worked within temple precincts, their knowledge considered as sacred as it was strategic. These documents were often works of art as well as tools, drawn on precious papyrus with carefully mixed inks, featuring elaborate illustrations of river deities alongside precise notations of depth and current. In Rome, the compilation of field reports into finished military maps was a centralized, state-controlled operation. Teams of copyists worked in secure environments, each perhaps responsible for only a small section of a larger map to prevent any single person from possessing the complete geographic knowledge of a frontier. The penalty for error or for leaking these documents was severe, often death, reflecting the immense value placed on their accuracy and secrecy. These anonymous artisans, bending over their scrolls by lamplight, were the final link in the chain, transforming perilously gathered data into the clean, authoritative lines that would guide the march of legions. Recognizing these cartographers changes our entire understanding of how empires functioned. We rightly remember the names of great conquerors like Alexander or Caesar, but we forget that their most brilliant maneuvers were made possible by the unnamed scouts who found the fordable river crossing, the engineers who calculated the precise spot to build a bridge, and the scribes who drew the map that made it all clear. Empire building was a collaborative effort between the force of arms and the power of knowledge. The general provided the will, but the cartographer provided the way. Their legacy is a reminder that history is not only shaped by the loud, dramatic actions on the battlefield, but also by the quiet, deliberate strokes of a pen on parchment, patiently mapping the paths of power. From the winding Nile to the mighty Yangtze, the story of ancient river maps reveals a profound truth about power and knowledge. These were not simple charts for navigation. They were the secret blueprints of empire, instruments of strategy, deception, and domination that quietly shaped the destiny of civilizations. We've journeyed through history to see how a piece of papyrus or a clay tablet could orchestral the movement of entire armies, sustain supply lines across impossible distances, and even turn the environment itself into a weapon. They fueled psychological warfare by demonstrating a conqueror's terrifying omniscience, suggesting that if an enemy knew the intimate secrets of your land and its lifeblood, how could you possibly hide or defend against them? These documents enabled acts of environmental manipulation on a staggering scale, from breaching dikes to drown rival states to diverting entire rivers to starve cities into submission. This proves beyond any doubt that in the ancient world, knowledge of geography was often as decisive as the strength of any army, the sharpness of any sword. The most striking aspect of this history is how vividly it echoes in our modern world. The lessons encoded in those ancient maps were not forgotten, they were simply upgraded. Today, nations no longer fight over papyrus scrolls detailing the Nile's inundation, but they engage in tense standoffs over satellite data and hydrological models of the very same river, where the construction of a single modern dam can hold an entire region hostage. The control of the Tigris and Euphrates, once the prize of Assyrian and Babylonian kings, remains a flashpoint for conflict, now mediated through international water treaties and engineering reports instead of clay tablets. The strategic competition in the South China Sea is, at its core, a high-tech cartographic battle to control crucial waterways and the resources they contain. This undeniable continuity reminds us that the past is never truly past. The fundamental human struggle to control the sources of life and the paths of commerce continues. Only the tools have changed from reed pens to remote sensors. As we reflect on this incredible hidden history, it's worth considering how much of our present world was built upon the secrets once held in those carefully guarded charts. The borders of modern nations, the locations of our greatest cities, the very routes of global trade, so much of it was influenced by the strategic decisions made by long-dead generals studying their river maps. They understood that to command the water was to command the future, a principle that continues to dictate global politics. This journey through the weaponization of geography reveals the astonishing ingenuity and, at times, the terrifying ruthlessness of our ancestors. If you found this dive into the hidden currents of history fascinating, we'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. What other untold stories of ancient technology and strategy should we explore next? Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the secrets history tried